A wealthy, cold man returns to his ex-wife's grave after 20 years, only to discover a shocking secret. The son he once rejected is now grown, standing before his mother's tomb. This fateful encounter will change everything. Will the truth be strong enough to heal old wounds? On a frigid December afternoon, Boston lay shrouded in a dreamy haze, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the thick, snow-covered ground. Jonathan Clark, a man in his 50s, stood silently in the stillness, his sharp eyes fixed on the dark tombstone before him. The surrounding scene felt cold and desolate, much like his life had been for so many years. Skyscrapers, luxurious boardrooms, extravagant parties, all the things that once fueled his existence now failed to fill the gaping void within him. Beside the tombstone, Jonathan noticed another figure, a young man, 19 years old, sitting by the grave of Emma, Jonathan's ex-wife. The boy's head was bowed, his shoulders trembling in the icy air, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken grief. Jonathan couldn't help but notice those eyes, those piercing blue eyes, cold and familiar, just like his own. And when the boy looked up, the shock on Jonathan's face was as vivid as a bolt of lightning cutting through the night. This was his son. Frozen in place, Jonathan felt as though he'd been thrust into a strange world he'd forgotten for 19 years. The coldness in the young man's gaze made him realize that he was no longer the father his son needed. This boy was no longer the child he had once rejected, no longer the infant he had abandoned along with his mother. Time, forgiveness, or any excuse could not undo that. To understand the tension of this moment, we must rewind 19 years. Emma, Jonathan's beautiful wife, was a woman full of patience and love. In the early years of their marriage, they had been happy, so happy it seemed nothing could break their bond. But everything changed when Emma became pregnant. One day stands out, Jonathan sitting across from her in a brightly lit room, his face crumbling as she spoke. "Jonathan, I have good news. I'm pregnant." He looked into her eyes, but instead of joy, there was only doubt. "Are you sure? You're really pregnant? Are you certain the baby is mine?" His cold, cutting questions pierced Emma's heart. Their relationship fractured quickly, and soon after, Jonathan's rejection drove Emma out of his life. Though Emma swore she had never betrayed him, though she had loved and trusted him for 5 years, Jonathan's suspicions couldn't be silenced. He consulted doctors, and medical tests confirmed a painful truth. He was infertile. This revelation gnawed at him, deepening his distrust of everything around him. "You're not the mother of my child. You must have deceived me," Jonathan had told Emma, his face devoid of emotion. She tried to explain, but her words fell on deaf ears. Just one night later, Emma left the mansion they had once called home, taking with her only a small suitcase and a shattered heart. After Emma's departure, Jonathan continued living in the sprawling mansion, a place that no longer held warmth or happiness. He threw himself into work, meetings, deals, anything to drown out the pain of loss. But at night, when the city lights dimmed, dreams of Emma and the child he'd never embraced haunted him. Jonathan never searched for Emma. He thought if she wanted to return, she would find a way. But as time passed, the emptiness in his life grew more apparent. Career successes couldn't fill the void left by Emma and their child. He had once had everything, but now all that remained was loneliness. And now, standing before Emma's grave, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder. Had he been wrong to reject that child? Was the price he paid for his choices worth it? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered by anyone. As the streetlight's glow illuminated Jonathan's face, he realized he'd been standing by Emma's grave and the son he'd never truly known for far too long. In that moment, he understood that there was one thing he could never build, despite all the wealth and power in the world: a real family. Walking slowly away, Jonathan glanced up. The sharp, cold eyes of his 19-year-old son still watched him. Winter in Boston was never gentle, but for Emma, each snowfall carried an indescribable chill. Not from the air, but from deep within her heart. She stood by the window of the room she had once shared with Jonathan, gazing out as snowflakes began to drift down, blanketing everything in sight. Each flake felt like a reminder of the life she once had, a life that seemed perfect but crumbled so easily under the weight of suspicion and coldness from the man she loved. Emma tightened her grip on her belly, where a tiny life was growing day by day. She couldn't fathom why Jonathan could doubt her so deeply. "I've loved you for 5 years. How could you think I'd betray you?" Her questions echoed in her mind, but they never received the answers they deserved. That day, when Jonathan stood there, tossing a check into her hands and demanding she leave without a single apology or shred of empathy, Emma's heart shattered. "Don't ever come back. You're no longer part of my life," he said icily, making her feel like a meaningless object in his eyes. "Money's enough. Go and don't bother me again." Emma looked at the check. The price, Jonathan thought, could buy her off. But it wasn't what she needed. She didn't need money. She needed love. A real family. But now, she was alone. The sun growing inside her was the last piece of Jonathan she had left. Yet it was because of this child that she'd been abandoned. With a gaze full of pain, Emma turned and walked out of the house she'd once believed would be her forever home. She didn't take much, just a small suitcase, a few clothes, and memories that had faded with time. But the one thing she carried in her heart was resolve. She wouldn't let her son grow up in the shadow of hatred and doubt. She would build a future for him on her own, a future free from Jonathan's coldness and deceit. Emma's footsteps echoed steadily on Boston's empty streets. The winter chill couldn't deter her. She had once thought this life was a shared choice, but now she knew it rested solely on her shoulders. She couldn't redo the past, but she could shape her future and her son's. In her final hours in Boston, Emma found herself at a bus station. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain but from a strange sensation, liberation. She had once believed she couldn't live without Jonathan, that she couldn't overcome the sting of his betrayal. But now she realized this freedom was the greatest gift she could give herself and the child she carried. She paused at the ticket counter, her hands trembling as she requested a ticket to Chicago. She didn't know how she'd get by there or what life would hold, but at least it offered a chance to start over. She had nothing left but faith in herself and the tiny son she would raise. "I'll be okay," Emma whispered to herself, though tears still silently rolled down her cheeks. Before boarding, she turned for one last look at Boston, the city where she'd once dreamed of a happy family. But now it was just a hazy memory, no longer strong enough to hold her back. "I won't return," she murmured, a promise to herself. Then, Emma stepped onto the bus, heading toward a strange new city where she would begin anew. The bus pulled away from Boston in the darkness, carrying a pregnant woman, a resilient mother, and a heart full of hope. The cold wind swept through the wide streets of Chicago, playfully, tugging at the thin curtains in the small apartment where Emma and Callum had just begun their new life. The space wasn't large, but to Emma it brimmed with fresh hope. The thin walls couldn't hide the loneliness entirely, but it wasn't a hopeless kind. She looked around, feeling a peace she hadn't dared to dream of in years. Emma sat in an old armchair, her trembling hands cradling her belly, where her child was growing day by day. Though everything around her might feel uncertain and hazy, there was a warmth in her heart, a fierce belief in herself and the future. That was Callum, her only son, the child she had nurtured through the challenging times in Boston. Now he darted around the small room, laughing carefree as if he'd never known pain. Callum ran to the window, his eyes sparkling like flames, his tiny hands brushing against the frosty glass. "Mom, look, it's snowing," he exclaimed, his clear voice ringing through the quiet room. Emma smiled, her eyes misting with tears she held back. That simple happiness was something only she could fully understand. For so long, she thought she'd never smile again, but watching Callum, she knew she still had a reason to keep going. The TV in the corner buzzed with noise, but Emma never paid it much attention. She didn't have time for news or other people's stories. Her world revolved around Callum, the child she loved more than anything. Work wasn't easy. Emma had found a job as a waitress at a small diner in the neighborhood, serving mostly late-night workers or hurried tourists who didn't spare a second glance. She worked tirelessly, her hands and feet aching, but her resolve never wavered. Each morning she woke up feeling stronger. Each afternoon, when she picked Callum up from school, she felt a piece of her life settle into peace, if only for a moment. Callum, with his clear eyes and softly curled brown hair, was everything to her. His innocent questions, though, often pierced her heart. "Mom, where's Dad?" he had asked countless times, and each time Emma forced a smile, her chest heavy with unspoken weight. She didn't know how to answer him, so she simply pulled him close, realizing she'd been hiding her pain for too long. Yet Callum never lost his faith in life. He found joy in what he had. "Mom, when can we go to the park?" he'd ask whenever the sky cleared and birds soared overhead. Emma would look at him, smile, and say, "We'll go when I have time, my love, I promise." With each passing day, Emma felt as though she'd almost lived a new life, imperfect but hers. Late at night, when everything grew still, she'd sit by the window, gazing out at the bustling streets lit by glowing lights. Loneliness still crept in, but even in that solitude, a burning belief flared within her. She would never give up. One evening, after a long shift, Emma sank into the worn armchair, closing her eyes to relax, her mind empty. Callum sat beside her, looking up with his wide, round eyes. "Mom, are we going to live here forever?" The sudden question tightened her chest. She leaned down, pulling him into her arms, and whispered, "I'll make us a beautiful place, a real home, where you can laugh and play without a single worry." Emma knew that, without Jonathan, despite the lingering pain of the past, she still had Callum, the son she'd do anything to protect and raise. No matter how hard it was to start over, she'd never let her son endure the suffering she had. And even on the exhausting days, Emma could always find joy in the simplest moments. To her, nothing else mattered anymore. As long as Callum was happy, as long as her son could live a life filled with love, she knew she could overcome anything. She would build a new future, not just for herself, but for the only son she had. The years passed, and Callum grew, not just in stature, but in thought and emotion. The little boy with bright eyes and an innocent smile had become a 19-year-old young man, burdened with questions about his past that no one could answer. The things he'd never known, the gaps in his memory that his mother steadfastly refused to address, slowly turned into an unrelenting unease in his mind. Though Emma had given him all her love, care, and heartfelt guidance, Callum couldn't shake the sense of absence. The feeling of a child missing a father's presence, even one he'd never met or seen. Every time he saw other children walking hand in hand with their parents, Callum felt like a piece of himself was incomplete. "Where's Dad?" he'd asked his mother countless times, and each time Emma would only smile, pull him into her arms, and say, "Your father's somewhere far away, but you don't lack anything." But her answers never eased the restlessness in Callum's heart. He began to wonder if a part of himself was truly missing, especially when it came to his father. He didn't know who the man was, or what he'd thought when he abandoned both mother and son. Every time he saw the name Creighton in articles or advertisements about towering skyscrapers, an indescribable frustration stirred within him. It was his father's name, but also a piece of history he'd never been allowed to know. One day, while researching a school project on architecture, Callum stumbled across an article about Creighton Enterprises. The founder's name stood out starkly on the screen, accompanied by photos of the buildings he'd created. In that moment, a strange sensation surged within Callum. A feeling he'd never experienced before. Thaddeus Creighton. That was the name of the man who'd rejected his son before he was even born. A man who had since built a powerful empire from nothing. Callum sat still in front of the screen, his heart pounding. Could this be the sign he'd been searching for all along? He made a decision. No matter how difficult it might be, no matter the coldness he might face from his father, he would seek out Thaddeus Creighton. He needed to know, and more importantly, he needed to uncover the truth his mother had always kept hidden. In the days that followed, Callum began scouring the internet for information about Thaddeus. Articles, interviews, and accounts from people who'd worked with Creighton Enterprises started to surface. With each piece of information he read, his heart beat faster. What he knew about his father amounted to mere fragments, but they were enough to fuel his curiosity and longing to meet him. "I need to know," Callum told himself. "I need to meet him, no matter the reason." He knew the journey wouldn't be easy. Thaddeus might not want to see him, might not care about his existence at all. But for Callum, finding his father wasn't just about seeking recognition. It was a step toward understanding himself, toward grasping why he existed in the first place. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Callum quietly sat at the table, opened his laptop, and continued researching Thaddeus Creighton. He didn't realize that beyond the cold facts and distant miles, he was about to step into an encounter that would change his life, and perhaps his mother's forever. Callum couldn't stop thinking about this meeting. Ever since he decided to seek out Thaddeus Creighton, sleepless nights had become his constant companion. Questions about his father, restless thoughts, hopes, and fears intertwined in his mind. He knew this wasn't just a simple encounter. It was a journey to unravel a part of himself. The first time he'd face the man he'd never known, but who had haunted his every dream. The vast room in the towering headquarters of Creighton Enterprises made Callum feel like a tiny insect standing before a colossal empire. The glass walls reflected the city's lights, creating a space that was cold, luxurious, and steeped in power. Even the air seemed to carry a distinct chill. Callum felt as though he'd wandered into a world he didn't belong to, a world of wealth and influence he'd never been a part of, not even in the smallest way. As the elevator carried him to the top floor, each second stretched like a century. The tension inside him swelled like a wave. Memories of his mother, years of loneliness, and unanswered questions flooding his mind. He caught his reflection in the elevator's mirror. Those blue eyes, that familiar face of a man he'd never met. Yet those very features made him feel a mysterious connection to the man he called his father. When the elevator doors opened, a stern guard with razor-sharp eyes motioned for Callum to follow. The guard led him through a long hallway where the only sound was the echo of their shoes on the cold stone floor. Each step brought Callum closer to a door he couldn't turn back from. Finally, they stopped before a large door, the darkness and light within the room awaiting him, along with the truth he'd sought for so long. As the door swung open, Callum couldn't help but take a sharp breath. Thaddeus Creighton sat there, behind a wide desk, the light from the windows illuminating his strong yet solitary figure. Though time had left its mark on Thaddeus' face, he exuded an indescribable presence. His piercing blue eyes met Callum's with a cold sharpness, but something in that gaze unsettled Callum. Clearly, Thaddeus hadn't expected the person standing before him to be the son he'd abandoned. "Who are you?" Thaddeus spoke, his voice icy, though it couldn't mask a hint of surprise and unease. Callum stood still, meeting his father's gaze, feeling for the first time the weight of a look from a man he'd never known. "I'm Callum, your son," Callum said, his voice trembling slightly but resolute. "I'm your son with my mother, Emma." A long silence stretched between them. Thaddeus said nothing, his eyes drifting into the distance, as if flipping through pages of memories he'd buried long ago. Callum couldn't read his thoughts. Did he feel anything at seeing his son? Or was this just a meeting with a stranger? "Son?" Thaddeus finally spoke, his voice still dry and devoid of emotion. "Are you really my son?" Callum couldn't hold back the mix of anger and pain rising within him. "Who else would I be? A child you abandoned, never once looked for, never cared about. I'm not your dream. I'm real." He couldn't contain his emotions. The years of growing up without a father's love, The unanswered questions all surged like a storm in his chest. Thaddeus sat motionless, silently watching his son. Those sharp, cold eyes now brimmed with emotions Callum couldn't decipher. Thaddeus lowered his head, as if reflecting on the choices he'd made in the past, but there was no apology, no clear acknowledgement. "Why are you here?" Thaddeus asked, seemingly trying to maintain distance, though something in his tone kept Callum from walking away without an answer. "I just want to know why you abandoned us, why you chose everything except family." Callum's voice broke with emotion. Thaddeus looked up, meeting Callum's gaze once more. The coldness in his eyes had faded, replaced by a weariness, as if he'd grown tired of the invisible battles he'd created for himself. But the answer still didn't come. In that space, amid the unspoken questions, Callum realized this meeting wasn't about seeking forgiveness from his father. It was about understanding that sometimes a man's coldness wasn't rejection, but the result of wounds he carried within. The story had no conclusion yet, but for Callum, a significant step had been taken. He was no longer the child dreaming of a perfect father. He'd met him, seen him, and most importantly, he'd found himself. Callum couldn't sleep. Though his body was exhausted, his mind refused to quiet down. The images of his meeting with Thaddeus Creighton replayed in his head like a slow-motion film he couldn't turn off. Every cold glance from that man, every awkward word devoid of emotion, felt like a knife piercing his heart. Thaddeus wasn't the father Callum had dreamed of. He didn't open up, didn't acknowledge him. There was nothing but a ruthless coldness. He sat up in bed, the faint glow from the streetlights filtering through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Callum's gaze fell on an old photo of himself and his mother, taken on a summer day in Boston when he was still a carefree child, unaware of the pain she'd endured. In his innocent eyes back then, there had been only one belief, that his father would return, that one day Thaddeus Creighton would understand and embrace them. But now, after that meeting, that belief was crumbling. "He doesn't care about me," Callum said to himself, his voice hoarse. Not a single apology, not a hint of regret. All he has is coldness, coldness with no reason to explain it. A wave of disappointment surged within him. He felt like a child abandoned, not just because he lacked a father, but because he'd never had the chance to truly understand him. Thaddeus was an unreachable figure, someone for whom Callum's existence held no meaning. But then, amid that storm of emotions, an unexpected thought struck him. Am I expecting too much? He wondered. Am I searching for something he was never capable of giving me? It was as if a spark ignited in his chest, and Callum began to question whether he'd been seeking too much validation from a man who didn't know how to love. The words his mother Emma had spoken to him, the things she'd always tried to shield him from, echoed in his mind now. You don't need his acceptance. You have everything you need. She'd always told him that, and though he hadn't fully grasped it before, he could feel the truth in it now. The regret began to fade, giving way to a new sensation, a sense of release. Callum was no longer haunted by Thaddeus's absence. He'd met him, faced him, but it wasn't the ending he'd hoped for. He couldn't change the past or how Thaddeus treated him, but Callum realized he had the power to change how he viewed his own life. He stood, his legs trembling slightly from overthinking. Stepping toward the window, he looked out at the night lights reflecting off the glass. His eyes no longer held fear or regret. He wasn't bound by Thaddeus Creighton's shadow anymore. Callum understood that his life didn't hinge on what Thaddeus thought of him. His mother had given him everything he needed, and from now on, he wouldn't seek validation from anyone else. All I need is Mom and myself, Callum whispered, and those words seemed to lift the exhaustion from his soul. He returned to his bed, sat down, and for the first time felt a lightness. The burden had slipped from his shoulders. Callum no longer had to strain under the weight of a father who didn't deserve him. He realized that, with or without Thaddeus in his life, he could build a full life. one filled with his mother's love and the genuine friendship of people like Margaret and Nancy. The next day, as Callum stepped outside, there was no trace of sadness or vague questions lingering in his mind. He walked with a newfound resolve, his gaze steady on the life ahead. It wasn't Thaddeus who would shape his future. It was Callum himself. What he'd found wasn't acknowledgement from a father incapable of love, but liberation from pain that wasn't worth carrying. My life is mine to control, Callum thought, and for the first time he felt truly free. Spring had arrived in Chicago, but Callum felt no warmth from the season within him. Everything around him was vibrant, the bustling streets filled with people, the trees budding with new life. But for Callum, a lingering emptiness still enveloped him, as if nothing could erase it. He had met his father. He had found him in the cold world of skyscrapers, in the name Creighton that he'd once thought might hold meaning for him. But now, after everything that had happened, Callum realized that Thaddeus's presence in his life wasn't an answer. It was a vast, unanswerable question. That painful encounter, however, had made Callum see that he no longer needed to seek acceptance from his father. He didn't have to keep living in the shadow of unanswered questions. The long journey he'd traveled with his mother had taught him one thing. Love wasn't something to be found in those who didn't deserve it. True love was realizing you could stand on your own, even without anyone by your side. Emma and Callum continued their life in that small apartment. The days weren't long, but for Emma, they were the most wonderful she could have hoped for. Callum, though still occasionally lost in thoughts of his father, grew to understand that happiness wasn't something to be sought from strangers. Happiness lay within himself, in the simple moments and the people who truly loved him. And he realized that it wasn't Thaddeus's absence that left his life lacking. It was his mother's presence that made it whole. One afternoon after a tiring day at school, Callum returned home and found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The soft golden light illuminated her face, giving her an unusual warmth in the space. He sat across from her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mom, I've been thinking about him," Callum said, his voice calm but tinged with something unfamiliar. Emma set her tea down, her gaze meeting his with deep understanding. "You don't need to think about him anymore, Callum. You've met him, and you've understood everything. Let the past rest, my love." Callum looked at his mother, and a strange sensation welled up inside him. It was as if a heavy stone had fallen from his chest, a relief he'd never felt before. He recalled the meeting with Thaddeus, the distant eyes, the indifferent words, the overwhelming disappointment. But now, things were different. He no longer needed to seek validation from that man. He didn't have to please him to feel worthy. "Mom, I'll be okay, right?" Callum asked, his eyes shining with a certainty he hadn't noticed in himself before. Emma smiled, her eyes sparkling. "You've always been okay, Callum. You're strong. You'll always find your way. I've believed that since you were a baby." A sense of peace spread through Callum's heart. He no longer felt the ache of absence, the emotional void left by Thaddeus. He'd learned that even without a father, he could still have everything he needed. He had his mother, the most wonderful mother, who had given him all the love, resilience, and strength to stand tall in life. "I think I get it now, Mom. I don't need his approval. I have you, and that's all I need," Callum said, his eyes bright with newfound conviction. Emma took her son's hand, her grip warm and steady. "That's right, my love. Love is something we can give, not something we have to search for. And I'll always be here with you, no matter what." Those words wrapped around Callum like a warm embrace, making him feel protected, loved, and free. He no longer had to dwell on the past. He didn't have to live with Thaddeus's unanswered questions. He could let it all go and walk forward on his own path. Then, Callum looked up at his mother, his eyes filled with gratitude. He knew that despite the vast world around him, she was the most important person, the only one he'd never need to seek acceptance from. "Thank you, Mom, for always being there for me," Callum whispered. "No need to thank me, my love. I'm here, and I'll always be here." As Callum gazed out the window, the fading daylight bathed the ground, and he felt an immense sense of liberation. His steps grew steadier, his decisions clearer. He was no longer haunted by things beyond his control. This freedom didn't just come from leaving the past behind. It came from within, from accepting himself and cherishing what he had. And so Callum moved forward, more confident and stronger than ever.